Welcome back, class. Today might be the most important lesson in our quadratic equations unit. We're going to learn one of the most famous formulas in all of math, the quadratic formula. It can solve any quadratic equation, even ones we can't easily solve with the other methods we've learned. But there's just one problem with the quadratic formula. It's pretty scary looking. It looks like this. Now, I know what you're all thinking. As Tom would say, this looks extremely impossible.
Mr. Caldwell, we do not think the quadratic formula looks extremely impossible. Are you surprised?
Wow, Tom. Most students find this formula pretty intimidating.
Is it surprising to you that we aren't scared of this quadratic formula? Would you call this an unexpected surprise?
Tom, shh! Cut it out! Don't spoil it.
Keep going, Mr. Caldwell.
The quadratic formula is so important that I want you all to try to memorize it. I know it looks hard, but if we have time at the end of class, I'll give you some tips to help you memorize it. First though, let's see the quadratic formula in action. We use the formula when we have a quadratic equation that's set equal to 0, and we need to solve for x. That's why it starts with this x equals on the left side of the formula. To figure out what x is, we have to solve the right side of the formula. But you're probably noticing that the right side is this giant scary looking fraction full of a's and b's and c's. Quadratic equations don't have a's or b's or c's in them. They have x squareds and x's and numbers in them. So what are we even supposed to plug in for these a's and b's and c's? Well, think back to what we learned in our earlier lessons. Every quadratic equation has 3 ingredients: a certain amount of x squareds, then a certain amount of plain old x's, and then some regular number at the end. Different equations can have different amounts of these 3 ingredients. So we use the letter a to mean however many x squareds are in our equation, and the letter b to mean however many plain old x's are in our equation, and the letter c to mean the regular number at the end of our equation. Those are the a, b, and c values we plug into our quadratic formula. So let's try it. These 3 quadratics are arranged from easiest to hardest. Let's try the easiest one first. X squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Before we start, notice that this is an equation we could also solve by factoring with our product sum method. And unless a problem tells you that you have to use a certain method, you can use whichever one works best for you. So let's use the quadratic formula to solve this one, then go back and check our answer by solving it again with the product sum method. Alright, who can tell me what our a, b, and c values are in this equation?
Our a value is the amount of x squareds we have. We have only one single x squared, so a is 1. B is how many x's we have, which is plus 5, meaning positive 5. C is the regular number at the end, which is plus 6, meaning positive 6.
Good, V9. A is 1, B is 5, and C is 6. So now we plug those into our quadratic formula, which will tell us the solution for x. Who can help me put our a, b, and c values into the quadratic formula?
The formula starts with negative b. For this equation, that means negative 5. But then the formula has a plus or minus symbol. I am not sure what to do with that, teacher.
For right now, Wendigo, let's just write down the plus or minus symbol and come back to it. We'll deal with it at the end. Keep going.
Next, we have the square root of the quantity b squared minus 4ac. b is 5, so b squared is 25. Minus 4 times a times c means subtract 4 times 1 times 6. So we have the square root of 25 minus 24, which is 1.
Well done, Wendigo. Now, class, I want to warn you that when we use the quadratic formula, this quantity under the radical, the square root sign, can be the hardest part. It can give us some pretty hairy square roots. But we got lucky this time. We can all probably see what the square root of 1 is going to be. For right now though, let's leave the radical this way and finish our formula. We'll do these calculations last. So who can help me write the denominator of our formula? The bottom.
This is the easier part. It just says to divide by 2a. That's 2 times 1, which is 2.
Right, Bones. So our whole formula is x equals -5 plus or minus the square root of 1, all divided by 2. Now we can simplify. What's the square root of 1?
Mr. C, you taught us that positive numbers have 2 square roots. The square root of 1 is +1 and also -1, right?
That's right, Ruby. But let's notice something. Wendigo asked about this plus or minus sign in the formula. The reason that the plus or minus sign is here is to remind us to use the positive and negative square roots, just like you said. Since the formula is doing that for us, it's okay to just say that the square root of 1 is plain old +1. When we do that, we get x equals -5 plus or minus 1 all divided by 2. Now we just need to calculate the answer. Does anyone remember how we solve equations that have this plus or minus sign in them?
Ooh, I know. We make 2 separate equations. One equation uses the plus number. The other equation uses the minus number. Then we solve them separately.
Excellent, Codette. Let's do that. Our first equation is x equals -5 plus 1 divided by 2. Our second equation is x equals -5 minus 1 divided by 2. When we solve our first equation, we get x equals -2. When we solve our second equation, we get x equals -3. That's it. Both answers are correct, because if we plug in -2 or -3 for x in our original equation, we get an answer of 0, which is what we're looking for. So we write down both answers, x equals -2 and x equals -3, and we're done. Class, you just used the quadratic formula for the first time. Nicely done. Now, we said we were going to check our answers using our product sum method. Let's do that. In the product sum method, we look for 2 special numbers with a product of c, which is 6, and a sum of b, which is 5. What numbers work?
Like, I think 2 and 3 will work, won't they? 2 times 3 equals 6, and 2 plus 3 equals 5.
Good, Bones. So our equation in factored form is 0 equals x plus 2 times x plus 3. To solve it, we find any number that we can plug into either factor for x to give us 0 inside its parentheses. In the first factor, x equals -2. In the second factor, x equals -3.
Hey, those are the same 2 answers we got when we used the quadratic formula. X equals -2 and x equals -3.
That's right, Bones. We just checked our work and figured out that the quadratic formula did work. It gave us the same answer as our product sum method. So we could have used either of these methods to solve the equation. Let's move on to our second quadratic equation. It's a little bit harder. The equation is 2x squared plus 8 equals 0. Our first step with the quadratic formula is to figure out a, b, and c. Who can tell me what those are here?
A is the number of x squareds we have. The equation says 2x squared, so a is 2. B is how many plain old x's we have, but that's trickier. I think this is why you said this equation is harder. There aren't any x's in it. The equation goes straight from the x squareds to the plus 8 at the end.
You're right, Ruby. Does anyone remember what b and c are in quadratic equations that don't have any x's or any regular number at the end?
You taught us that if we have no x's or no number at the end, that means we have none of those things. 0 of them. Since we have no x's in this equation, that means our b value is just 0, right?
Exactly right, Ruby. You're really wearing your thinking cap today.
Thanks, Mr. C.
Now, who can tell me what our c value is?
C is the regular number at the end. In this equation, it is +8, meaning +8.
Good, V9. So we have a is 2, b is 0, and c is 8. Now we plug them in. But we need to be careful because we're about to reach the second tricky part of this problem. Wendigo, can you get us started?
The quadratic formula begins with -b. Our b value is 0. but 0 cannot be positive or negative, so negative b is simply 0. Correct, teacher?
That's right, Wendigo. And after that, we see the plus or minus sign, but just like last time, we'll save it for later. We can come back to it at the end when we split our equation into a plus version and a minus version and solve them separately. What's next?
Then we have the square root of the quantity b squared minus 4 times a times c. B squared means 0 squared, which is just 0. Minus 4ac is minus 4 times 2 times 8, which is minus 64. So the top of our formula is plus or minus the square root of negative 64, correct?
That's right, Wendigo. And that's going to be tricky. But first let's finish writing our formula.
On the bottom, we need to divide by 2a. Our a value is 2, so 2 times 2 is 4.
Good. So our entire formula is x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 64 divided by 4. So let's come back to that tricky part I mentioned. What is the square root of negative 64? Do negative numbers have square roots?
I don't think they have any real square roots. A positive number squared is positive, and a negative number squared is also positive.
Right, Codette. Negative numbers have no real square roots, which means that this quadratic equation has no values for x that give us an answer of 0. It has no real solutions. That may sound pretty strange, but it just means the graph of this equation is a parabola that turns around before it ever reaches the x-axis. It has no x-intercepts, no zeros as we call them. So we just learned something. When the quadratic formula gives us an answer with the square root of a negative number, it's telling us that there are no real solutions. Our quadratic equation has no 0 points. Class, you've done an excellent job so far. Let's finish our lesson by using the quadratic formula to solve our hardest equation.
Mr. Caldwell, I have a question about this thing, the quadratic formula.
Quadratic formula, Tom.
Yes, that's what I said. Mr. Caldwell, this quadratic formula is extremely long. I am wondering if there is an easy way to memorize it. How do you say it? A mnemonymous advice.
A mnemonic device?
Yes, that's what I said. You know, like a song or something to help the drac remember all of this formula.
Tom, I wish there were a song, but unfortunately, I think you just have to memorize it piece by piece.
What a shame, Mr. Caldwell. I will not hide that I am disappointed. I cannot keep it a secret that I had hoped for an easier way to memorize this thing.
Thomas Vladimir Dracula, you are super bad at spoiling surprises.
Tom, if you need help memorizing the quadratic formula, I'm happy to work with you after class. But right now, let's use the formula to solve our toughest equation. Our final equation is negative 4x squared minus 3x plus 2 equals 0. It would be pretty hard to solve this one using the other methods we know, like the product sum method or the grouping method. We could use completing the square or taking the square root of both sides, but they wouldn't be any easier than the quadratic formula. So remember, no method is always the easiest. The quadratic formula may not look easy, but sometimes it actually is the easiest way of all. So who can get us started here?
First, we figure out what A, B, and C are. A is negative 4, B is negative 3, and C is positive 2.
Nice work, Codette. Who can help us plug those into the formula?
We start with negative b, which is negative 3. 2 negatives in a row, so those cancel each other out, and we get positive 3.
Good, Ruby. What comes next?
Next is the plus or minus sign, but we will solve that later. After that is the square root of the quantity b squared minus 4 times a times c. That is negative 3 squared minus 4 times negative 4 times 2. To defeat this quadratic equation, I will simplify this as the square root of 9 plus 32, which is the square root of 41.
Nicely done, V9. So the top of our formula is 3 plus or minus the square root of 41. What about the bottom?
We divide all of that by 2 times a. which is 2 times negative 4. So the bottom of our formula is negative 8.
That's right, Wendigo. When we put it all together, we get 3 plus or minus the square root of 41, all divided by negative 8.
But Mr. C, what is that? I don't know what the square root of 41 is, so how am I supposed to figure out the answer?
Good question, Ruby. This is why I said this problem is harder than the last two. The square root doesn't end up being a whole number. And this happens a lot when we solve difficult quadratic equations. Remember, most numbers on the number line don't have nice clean square roots. So what are we supposed to do when we have one of those numbers under our radical sign? The good news is that we just keep those square roots the way they are. We write them as a number under a radical sign. We don't write them as a long, complicated decimal. So our final answer here is actually what we already said it was. X equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 41, all divided by negative 8. We can't simplify it any more than that, so we're done. Just make sure to remember that what we have here is actually two answers because of the plus or minus sign. 3 plus the square root of 41 all over negative 8, and 3 minus the square root of 41 all over negative 8. Well done today, class. You just learned how to use one of the most powerful tools in all of algebra, the quadratic formula. Now, if you'll just spend some time memorizing the formula, you'll be able to use it to solve any quadratic equation.
Mr. Caldwell.
Don't worry, Tom. I know our class time is almost over. I was just going to spend our final minute or two trying to help everyone start memorizing the quadratic formula.
Actually, Mr. C, there's something Tom has been waiting to tell you.
Yeah, like, it's a secret, so he wants to make sure everybody knows.
A secret?
Mr. Caldwell, we have a surprise for you. We have all decided to give you a gift.
That's very generous, Tom, but you know I can't accept bribes in exchange for good grades.
Negative. This surprise is not a bribe.
And I think it will help us all earn good grades on our own, teacher.
Wow, class, that's terrific. Where is this gift? Can I see it?
Mr. Caldwell, I would say you can A, B, and C it. We have already memorized the quadratic formula. Prepare to be extremely impressed. This is a song about solving quadratics, the hardest kind of problem in like all of mathematics. There are many ways to solve such equations if you dare. There is factoring and grouping and completing of the square. But if these do not work or you need a better tactic, I recommend this formula that's known as the quadratic.
It's the quadratic formula, Tom, not the quadratic.
That's what I said, and it goes like this. If you want to solve for x, start with negative b, plus or minus the square root of the quantity. B squared minus 4 times a times c, then divide the whole thing by 2a. It's that easy.
Hold on a second, that's not easy enough. If I'm solving for x, what's this ABC stuff?
Think of your equation as a 3-part recipe.
Its 3 ingredients are A, B, and C.
A is how many x squareds you've got.
B is the number of x's after that.
Last comes a number by itself. That's c.
We plug them in our formula. Repeat after me. If you want to solve for x, start with negative b, plus or minus the square root of the quantity. B squared minus 4 times a times c. Then divide the whole thing by 2a. It's that easy.
This formula is a monster.
It looks pretty hairy,
But if you can remember it,
Quadratics aren't scary.
so if you do forget it,
Because your memory is full.
Or you're spacing out in class.
or your brain's not in your skull.
Don't worry. Just sing along.
As we sing the Quadratic Formula Song.
Tom,
The Quadratic Dracula Song?
Tom.
if If you want to solve for x, start with negative b.
Plus or minus the square root of the quantity
b squared minus 4 times a times c.
Then divide the whole thing by 2a. It's that easy.
If you want to solve for x, start with negative b.
Plus or minus the square root of the quantity
b squared minus 4 times a times c.
Then divide the whole thing by 2a. It's that easy.